So this commenter is saying that white people experience a form of racism where they are being treated as though they personally supported the system of slavery as opposed to their ancestors more than 3 generations ago, and that this has caused people to adopt an attitude of automatic disrespect towards them. And once my vision returned, because the sheer force of the ignorance from this comment struck me right between the eyes and I was temporarily struck blind, I thought to myself, I don't know this person, but I know 2 things about them. The first is that they don't know any black folks or people of color in general. And the second is that they are so divorced from reality that they are unable to conceptualize, even vaguely, the horrors of slavery. You see, if white folks now were being treated as though that they were specifically responsible for the slave trade, then in our modern society, they wouldn't be able to do anything. They wouldn't be able to go to the grocery store because they'd be afraid of being physically assaulted. They would have a hard time sleeping because they would be afraid that they're going to wake up to a house that's on fire. They wouldn't be able to go to school, go to work, or really do anything that requires social involvement because they would be actively shunned and ostracized and terrorized for being complicit in a crime against humanity. But that's not what's happening, is it? What's happening is that some white folks are having uncomfortable conversations with other people, often because they have interjected themselves into these conversations, and it's like they're wading into the water knowing they can't swim and they're upset that the ocean is salty. And now I'm going to end this on a personal note. I'm Chicano, I'm Mexican American, and there are people in my life, friends, family members, people who go to my church, who voted for a president who called Mexicans murderers and rapists. A president who has spoken openly multiple times about wanting to ethnically cleanse Mexicans from this country again. And yet I am able to extend a spirit of compassion and mercy towards them, to use community connection to try to help them see things differently. And if I were half the asshole that you think people of color are, then I wouldn't be able to do any of that. So, how about, instead of continuing to wade into waters that you are not able to swim in, you just back up to the shoreline, take a seat on the sand, and listen to what the waves have to say.
I find that a good way to help people who have a different lived experience than you exercise empathy for the struggles that you face that they may not be familiar with is to help them understand. And I was hoping that you could help me understand what anti-white racism looks like. Can you tell me about how you don't know where your ancestors came from because they were kidnapped and enslaved? Or how you don't know what languages they spoke, what spiritual practices they had, or what traditional knowledge that should have been your birthright was lost? Not because they were allowed to and wanted to assimilate, but because their enslavers or residential schools forced them to assimilate. Can you tell me about how your ancestors had explosives tied to them while they were building the United States railroads? And then as a show of appreciation, they were excluded from society for nearly 60 years? And could you tell me about the hundreds of towns that were destroyed, like the Black towns and Chinatowns and Japan towns, all destroyed by the same demographic? Can you tell me about the children who were unalived because they whistled at a woman or because they floated in a lake a little too far past the segregation line? And can you tell me how it was for your parents and your grandparents to be United States citizens who were put in internment camps on United States soil? Can you tell me how it was for your family to live in the back of their store because people who look like you were not allowed to purchase or rent homes? And could you tell me how it was for your parents and for you to shed blood, to be treated as human, as equal, and to be allowed to simply share the same space as other people? Can you tell me about the conversations that you have to have with your children about police interactions? And could you tell me about how your mother and your sisters and your daughters are concerned about having children because of lack of equitable access to healthcare, because doctors were told that people who look like you can't feel pain? Can you tell me how it feels to know that your ancestors lived here for thousands of years, but when you try to come here, you and your children are put in cages? And can you tell me how it felt when a few years ago, the president entertained having people who look like you expelled from the country again? Can you tell me what anti-white racism looks like beyond having your feelings hurt, feeling uncomfortable, and having your sense of superiority challenged? And when you're done telling me what anti-white racism feels like for you, could you please tell me why you're not fighting to end racism for everybody?
Racism is not a choice. You were not taught to be racist. You, fellow white person, like everybody else, were born into a world that you did not create. Everything you inherited, whether biologically or socially, was not your choice. And that's the same thing with racism. We were born into a racial caste system in which white-bodied individuals are the oppressor class. Whether you wanted that designation or not, that's the system that you and I were born into. We had no choice in the matter. However, once you become aware of how things are, once you've become educated about your role in how things are, then you have a choice. Do you want to stand firm and uphold the system you've inherited, fighting with anyone and everyone that brings up privilege, equity, justice, racial oppression? Or do you want things to change? More often than not, those of us that are white are so preoccupied with trying to separate ourselves from the group to justify and set ourselves apart as the good or safe white person. But when you live in a racial caste system, there's no such thing. We're all complicit in upholding the system until we start pushing against it and fight to dismantle it like our lives depend on it, because they do.
Hey, welcome back to my channel, where we dive into the most thought-provoking discussion from around the internet. Today, we are tackling a topic that sparked a lot of debate online. A recent comment went viral, claiming that white people are experiencing a form of racism in which they are treated as though they personally supported slavery, despite those events being tied to ancestors more than 3 generations ago. According to this commenter, this perception has caused many people to develop an attitude of automatic disrespect toward white individuals. Well, heavy stuff, right? Let's break it all down.
If you are not sure that all white people have opinions on racism, just bring it up the next time you're around a bunch of white people. Not only do we all have opinions, but they tend to be very emotionally charged, and that has nothing to do with whether they're informed or not. I have an opinion on virtually everything, but that does not make them informed. I don't believe you can grow up or spend any significant time in the United States without developing opinions on racism. And they will be emotional and strongly held. And again, that has nothing to do with whether they're informed. And in fact, if you are white and you have not devoted years of sustained study, struggle, and focus on this topic, your opinions are necessarily very limited. And no, a trip to Costa Rica, multiracial nieces and nephews, right? These are not sustained study, struggle, and focus. Now, how can I say that when I don't know most of the people in this room? And this, of course, is the first thing that tends to trigger white fragility, generalizing about white people. As a sociologist, I'm really comfortable generalizing about white people.
The comment claims that white people are being treated as though they personally upheld slavery, despite slavery being tied to ancestors over 3 generations ago. The commenter adds that this perception has led to an automatic attitude of disrespect toward white people. This idea stirred up quite a reaction, both agreement and backlash, and it's worth discussing. So, let's take a step back, unpack the layers of this argument, and explore why it's resonating with some and deeply troubling for others. Now, before we begin, I want to be clear, this is a complex and sensitive topic, so let's approach it with care and thoughtfulness. Let's focus on understanding different perspectives rather than pointing fingers or escalating tensions. To start, let's consider the core claim of this comment, that white people today are being unfairly treated as though they are personally responsible for slavery. A system that ended over 150 years ago. It's understandable that this perspective might resonate with some people. After all, being blamed or judged for something you didn't do can feel incredibly frustrating, especially when that something is as moral reprehensible as slavery. But here is the critical question. Is this truly what is happening? Are people actually blaming white individuals for the institution of slavery, or are they pointing to the broader systemic impact of racism that persists today? The truth lies somewhere in the middle. While there may be isolated instances where individuals experience hatred or blame toward white people, the broader societal conversation around race isn't about assigning personal guilt. Instead, it's about understanding how history has shaped the present. For example, systemic racism, inequality in housing, education, healthcare, and unemployment didn't emerge out of thin air. They are rooted in the history of slavery, segregation, and discrimination. So when people talk about privileges or systemic inequality, it's not about saying you personally caused this. It's about saying this history has left its mark and we all have a role in addressing it. Now let's talk about privilege, a term that often comes up in this conversation and tends to generate a lot of defensiveness. Privileges doesn't mean your life has been easy or that you haven't faced challenges. It simply means that your race isn't one of the factors making your life harder. For instance, a white person might not have to worry about being racially profiled while driving or receiving super health care because of racial basis. That doesn't mean they are wealthy, happy, or immune to other struggles. It just means their skin color isn't one of the obstacles. Understanding privileges is not about shaming or blaming. It's about recognizing how systems work and why they need to change. But unfortunately, the way this message is sometimes communicated can feel accusatory, which leads to reactions like the one we are discussing today. Some people hear privilege and interpret it as an attack on their character or their hard work. This disconnect is at the heart of many racial conversations. The commenter also mentioned an attitude of automatic disrespect toward white people. This brings us to another layer. Emotions, feeling disrespected or unfairly judged is a valid emotion, and it's important to acknowledge that. Nobody wants to feel like they are being lumped into a group of or blamed for something they didn't do. But here is the thing. Emotions, while valid, can sometimes cloud our ability to see the bigger picture. For example, feeling disrespected might lead someone to reject discussions about systemic racism altogether, even if those discussions hasn't meant as personal attacks. It's a natural reaction. We all want to defend ourselves when we feel misunderstood. However, what if instead of reacting defensively, we pause to ask, why might someone feel this way about me? What historical or personal experience have shaped their perspective? By shifting the focus from defending ourselves to understanding others, we can have much more productive conversations. Another point worth discussing is the idea that slavery was something that happened over 3 generations ago and therefore shouldn't impact how people are treated today. While it's true that none of us were alive during the era of slavery, its legacy is very much alive in the structures and institutions around us. Consider redlining, for example. This was a practice in the mid-20th century where banks and real estate companies denied loans and housing opportunities to black families, efficiently segregating neighborhoods and preventing wealth accumulation. The effects of redlining didn't disappear when the practice was outlawed. They persist in the form of racial wealth gaps and disparities in home ownership. So when people bring up slavery or historical injustice, it's not about dredging up old grievances. It's about understanding the past continues to shape the present. Ignoring this connection doesn't make the problem go away. It just makes it harder to address. Now, let's take a moment to look at how people reacted to this comment. As expected, there were two main camps, those who agree with the sentiment and those who push back against it. Supporters argue that constantly discussing race and historical injustice fosters division and creates resentment. They believe that emphasizing our shared humanity and moving forward together is the solution. Critics, on the other hand, pointed out that ignoring history doesn't heal wounds, it deepens them. They argue that acknowledging systemic racism isn't about blaming white people. It's about taking responsibilities as a social to create a more equitable future. Both sides bring valid points to the table. Yes, we should aim for unity, but unity without accountability isn't genuine, it's sufficiency. And accountability doesn't mean blaming individuals, it means recognizing and addressing systemic issues. So, where do we go from here? How do we bridge the gap between feeling unfairly blamed and acknowledging systemic inequality? The answer lies in empathy and education. First, we need to listen to each other, really listen. Instead of dismissing someone's feelings, ask questions. Why do they feel disrespected? What experiences have shaped their perspective? Second, we need to educate ourselves about history and how it connects to the present. Understanding systemic racism doesn't mean accepting personal blame. It means becoming part of the solution. Finally, we need to approach these conversations with humanity. Nobody has all the answers, and we are all learning as we go. What matters is that we are willing to engage, to question our assumptions, and to grow. In conclusion, the comment about white people feeling unfairly blamed for slavery touches on a real tension in our society, a tension between individual responsibility and collective accountability. While somebody alive today is personally responsible for slavery, we all live in a world shaped by its legacy. Instead of getting caught up in blame or defensiveness, let's focus on understanding each other and working together to create a more equitable world. These conversations aren't easy, but they are necessary, and with empathy, education, and humility, we can make progress. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. I did love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. Respectfully, take care, and I will see you in the next video.